Chapter 20 Vacation at Naalehu Ka'u. After I had enough rest during the month with my parents, I began to think about starting something new, or taking a real vacation and forgetting what had happened. Maybe this would ease my mind. I intended to go to Honolulu to start in the laundry business. I had it all planned, just as I had done with the previous business. Then I said to myself, just forget it for the time being. I thought about taking my car and heading for Naalehu Ka'u. I told my mother and father I was leaving the next day. Mother told me if I happened to pass Waiohinu by the way of Naalehu, I must see my great-grandfather, Peneliku. He was the great kahuna ana for the royal chief of Ka'u. He was living alone and was the last clan of the Makanui heirloom. Mother said he would tell me more about the Ku'ula Rock. She said she would repeat the family riddle code to me so that I may repeat it to Heneliku. This would be the key to unlock the secret of the mystery of the Ku'ula Rock. He was in direct line of those who took care of all the king's belongings. His grandfather before him set the rule and designated that the first son of the oldest girl in the family must be named Kepa, and he would be the one who would take over the responsibility of the king's belongings. My mother was the last daughter, and she was designated that the first son be named Kepa. When I came along, my mother forgot to name me Kepa. The Chinese always name the boy the day he is born. I was called Yun Che by my father, and that was all the name that I had at the time. I was a sickly little boy. My mother took me to the plantation doctor, and he couldn't find what the trouble was. He said I was not sick. A mother's intuition told her that something was wrong with me, so she took me to one of the family kahunas in Hilo. We stayed a week. During that time, she had a dream. In this dream, someone nailed my 2 feet. She was frightened and got up. She told the kahuna about the dream. He looked at her and said, "The answer for your son has arrived. How many names does he have?" She replied, "Just one name, which is a Chinese name, given by his father." The kahuna said, "One nail is out. Now for the second nail. Do you think someone may have wanted you to name this boy? Do not answer, but think. When you have the answer, let me know." My mother pondered over and over and tried to recollect from her childhood days. She finally remembered that her grandfather had set a taboo on her that the first boy should be called Kepa, and told the kahuna. He told her to name me. This she did by saying, "I now name you Kepa." That very moment, I was well. Then the kahuna said his last prayer of thanksgiving and told my mother, "You have done your duty. The rest leave to the boy to decide." I had not decided what I was going to do, but my great-grandfather said I could not assume the duties of taking care of the king's belongings, as I was only part Hawaiian. Being part Chinese, I might have aggressive ideas of making money by selling the king's belongings. That was the end of the name Kepa. This was the very man I was going to meet. My mother told me that when I was about 4 years old, he came to Pahoa. I did not remember. I bid my parents goodbye and was on my way to Ka'u for a vacation. I took my car and started for Naalehu Ka'u. I intended to stay at the Shimizu Hotel. It was a quiet place and had its Japanese bath, called furo. Every evening, Mr. Shimizu started to heat the bathtub. It was made of redwood and protected with galvanized iron around it. The bathroom was a small wooden room with concrete floor, and the bathtub was situated at one end. The heating was done outside of the building. There was a shower for hot and cold water. After I took a shower, I would sit in the bathtub for about 10 minutes, which was a nice, relaxing feeling. When I went into my room, I just fell asleep and didn't wake up until morning. Mr. Shimizu's place was situated on the left from the plantation store off the main highway coming from Hilo. There were lots of small stores along the way on one side until you reached the hotel. Next to the hotel was a beer bar owned by Mr. Shimizu. Mr. Kupahu owned the land, and his home was next to the hotel. He had a granddaughter named Elena living with him, who attended school at Naalehu. One evening, as I was walking back from the plantation store, I met Mr. Kupahu and spoke Hawaiian to him. From that time on, we both talked about many things concerning old Hawaii. I was interested in knowing what he had to say. He invited me to his home, and we became the best of friends. I stayed a few hours, and as I started to leave for the hotel, he asked me to stay at his place. I told him I had already made arrangements to stay at the hotel another week, but that I would come over to his place after that. From the day I came to live with Mr. Kupahu and his granddaughter, there was a change in my life. Instead of thinking about business, I began to relax and talk about things as they really happened. This interested me a lot. As to Mr. Kupahu, he was alone in his thoughts as before he had no one to talk to. I was happy to be of some help. He had just retired from the plantation after working there for nearly all of his life. He was about 70 years old, and I was only 30. I helped him with many of his business dealings with the different tenants leasing on his land. He was happy that his tenants paid all their rent on time. While I was there, I spent some of my time checking heiaus and ke'eula. There were a few old Hawaiians living there. I questioned them in Hawaiian, and they told me everything they remembered. They spoke of many vital subjects, but most of what I gathered was hearsay. In order to gain their confidence, one must live with them. Then at such times when they feel free, they will tell their inner feelings to you. This is the only way to get anything worthwhile. This is what I had in mind, to stay and be one of them. I visited Punalu'u and saw the Poorest Rock, and in this rock there were lots of small pebbles. If you picked up a rock and shook it, the many pebbles would not fall out. It was claimed that this rock gave birth to all of these small pebbles. I looked at the beach, and the sand was full of small pebbles, the same as in the Poorest Rock. All the Poorest Rocks that I examined were at one time in the ocean. As the waves washed the rocks to the sandy beach, the small pebbles set into the Poorest Rock. There was no legend that I knew of that told anything about the Poorest Rock, but there was much told from one to another, and a song that was sung, telling about the birth rock of Punalu'u. Punalu'u was a quaint little fishing village. There were a few Hawaiians living there, and still standing was an old Hawaiian church. About 20 yards from the shore, when the ocean was calm, you could see the spring water bubbling up from the bottom. It was told that when there was a drought, the people around Punalu'u would come and fill their wooden umeki, or calabash, with fresh water. The natives made their living by providing fish for the surrounding neighbors. From Punalu'u, you stopped at Hilea. This was a small plantation community of the people who worked for the Hutchinson Sugar Company. The people who lived there were of mixed nationality, and there were only a few Hawaiians of the younger generation. The old folks had all passed away, and the old memories were forgotten. The next stop near the landing was the sugar mill. There was a small store that served the employees who worked for the plantation. Sugar from the mill was shipped to Hilo by inter-island steamship. A short drive from Honuapo was the town of Naalehu. This was a plantation town where the office of the Hutchinson Sugar Company was located. It was a large community village that housed the employees. All of the responsible employees who ran the company lived near the main highway, and the rest lived in the back area. There were a few who owned private lands of their own through family ties, such as Mr. Kupahu. The people who lived on his land were not employees of the plantation. They had their own businesses that helped the economy of the little town. There was one theater that showed talking pictures on Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. There were several churches, a Catholic church on the main highway, and the others in the area where the employees of the plantation lived. I met Mr. Swain and his family as he, being one of the plantation superintendents, lived near the highway. I usually spent my time with him when I was not busy. We played cards once a week at night. The rest of the week, I kept notes and checked places of importance, like the ku'ula that was found by a plantation employee. His family had a store at the upper camp from Naalehu. I have already written all about the incidents pertaining to that ku'ula. One day, I happened to walk in the garden at the back of Mr. Kupahu's house. I came upon a rock that took my fancy. I brought it to the water faucet and washed the dirt off. It looked like a statue, and I left it in the yard by the house. I had a few incidents while the lock was lying out in the yard. Mr. Kupahu told me that where I found the rock, he had placed it against a papaya plant, and the rest of the plants grew taller, while the one with the rock against it was still small. One morning, about 5 o'clock, while I was still sleeping, I dreamed that two men arrived from Honolulu. One was a Chinese Hawaiian, and the other a Caucasian Hawaiian. In this dream, I had a bag full of opium, and these two men asked to buy it, but I didn't want to sell it. Then one spoke up. "We are on our way to Waikimilo on business, and when we return, we will see you again." They bid me goodbye and left. Mr. Kupahu came into the room and woke me up. It was about 6 o'clock. He said there were two men in the kitchen having breakfast, and maybe I knew them. I got up and washed my face and walked into the kitchen. I bid them good morning and said I was glad to meet them both. The two men were strangers to me, but they introduced themselves as buyers of Hawaiian artifacts that they wanted to sell in their Honolulu store. These were the very men I had dreamed about an hour before their arrival, so I was warned, but could not interpret all of the dream. I sat down, drank my coffee, and listened to their stories. The two strangers made a positive remark that they were very much in favor of buying the artifact, the ku'ula rock, that was standing outside Mr. Kupahu's residence. As they were leaving, the two walked to the ku'ula rock, gazed on it for a second, and looked at me. They wanted to take it then. I told them that the ku'ula rock belonged to Mr. Kupahu. I asked Mr. Kupahu if he wanted to sell it. He looked at me and said nothing. Then they spoke out. "We will go to Waikimilo, and when we return, we will come here to see you again. By that time, you will change your mind and sell." I told them, "We will wait until you return." They bid us goodbye and thanked us for the breakfast and left. I told Mr. Kupahu that the word Waikimilo was spoken in my dream. It was a small fishing hamlet about 10 miles away. I also told Mr. Kupahu that I was willing to bet that the two strangers would not return. He looked at me and did not say a word. I know he understood and that I was right. But what puzzled me was that he knowingly kept the truth to himself, and I shouldn't insist because he was told from his infancy not to divulge the secret, and it was hard to change his thought now. If I took my time, it would come out from him unintentionally. Then I told Mr. Kupahu I would go and get Peneli Ku to come there and tell me whether the Ku'ula rock was real or not, and he agreed to my suggestion. I took Elena, and we left for Waiohinu Uka. Waiohinu was the main town of Ka'u. This was the seat of the district of Ka'u. It was a neat little town and well planned. There was a tree growing in the center of town that was planted by Mark Twain. Its branches were so huge, they had to trim them to prevent them from breaking. When I arrived at Heneli Ku's, I repeated the family riddle code. This is the keeper's code, and he answered me. This is what I said. Kani koha ko'ele, and he answered, Hamale. The translation is, a loud sound with a rumbling echo. The reply? A hammer. He was stunned for a minute, but then he hugged me and cried. Then he told me that he prayed to see me before he died, and that it was an honor that I came to see him. He then beckoned me to come forward and be received. I introduced Elena to him and told him who she was. After all, she was my second cousin. I asked him how he knew I was coming to pick him up. He replied, I don't have to explain. When we come to Mr. Kupahu's house, you will know the answer. If I tell you here, you will not understand. You must watch me closely. This will be the first time I will show you. No one in the family has seen what I do. They just take my word because I am their grandfather. They all respect me, but you, my great-grandson, wanted to know and write about what I do so that your children and grandchildren will read about the Hawaiian culture. We walked to the car and started for Na'alehu. As I looked at Heneli Ku, I realized that this was one time that I would actually see the working of a kahuna talking to a ku'ula rock. It was a strange feeling. We arrived at Mr. Kupahu's house and walked into the kitchen. Heneli Ku greeted Mr. Kupahu, and I watched their reaction. After hugging each other, they sat down and talked about the past and the present. Their mood showed as in a family meeting. One was a converted Christian, and the other a kahuna. There were two beliefs, but whatever was in their present mind, the situation was like a family gathering. Elena looked at the time and said she would prepare lunch. I walked into the kitchen and left the two to talk without interruption. When lunch was ready, Mr. Kupahu offered the blessing. After lunch, we walked into the living room, and I talked to Heneli Ku about my dream. He explained to me that this was one of the different methods that the ku'ula used to try to make me understand. I also told him how I happened to pick up the ku'ula rock, and about the incidents that had happened connected to the rock, such as the boy who got a red face and fever from teasing and making faces about the rock, the voice heard when no one was around, and the image in the white sheet at the back door. I told him I had picked him up so I could find out if this ku'ula was the real thing. He said, by this time you should know that it is a real ku'ula. These are the very symptoms to make you see because the ku'ula wants a keeper. He is lonesome, looking for someone. He told me to take the ku'ula to a cave and leave it there, and then he will be happy. He said, it is dangerous to leave him out there in the yard because someone who can communicate will harm you. Let's go out and see this ku'ula rock of yours. As we came to the rock, we all stood around. From the left standing were Elena, myself, Heneli, and Mr. Kupahu. I was watching Heneli Ku's movements. He did not say a word. He concentrated his eyes on the ku'ula. I was watching for his reaction. In a second, he began to move. His shoulder blades were moving around. He turned his head from left to right slowly. He began to stoop forward. To me, it looked like something was resting on him. And then everything stopped, and his eyes became sleepy. He was in a trance. He began to chant in alphabetical sequence, using the alphabet 3 times, followed by a name. The voice seemed to come from his throat. It said, "I am Ku'ula o Kalawa. My keeper buried me. I am the Ku'ula of all the plants and fruit of the land. I have a sister, the Ku'ula for all the fish of the ocean. Are you my keeper?" He stood for about 5 or 6 minutes and then straightened himself, as if something left his body. He then threw out a deep breath of contentment, gave way, and sat on the ground. He was then in his normal state. He turned to me and asked for a glass of water. He drank it and then asked me, "Did you hear what the Ku'ula was saying?" I only speak through mental telepathy, and the voice you heard was that of the Ku'ula. The rock is human. It has a spirit that lives forever unless I catch it. This is the art of the Uhane Po'i, which means to catch the spirit. I did not want to keep the Ku'ula, as I promised my mother on the Bible. Haneli Ku said, "Take the Ku'ula and place him in a cave and say, 'I am leaving you here, and this is your home. I know you are happy.' After you have spoken, you will walk straight out and don't look back. If you do look back, then the spirit of the Ku'ula will be with you, and you will be his keeper." I told Heneliku I would do this as soon as I could locate a cave near Naalehu. I left the rock on a shelf in the kitchen near the door. I asked Heneliku to stay for supper before I took him home, but he said he wanted to go home so he could feed the animals. As we were driving home, I asked him about Mr. Kupahu. He told me that he knew all about the Ku'ula, but he was trying to ignore it. It was hard for him to change from what he was taught as a boy. He still had the belief in his heart, but he tried to pretend he was a Christian. When he was with Heneliku, he talked the same language as he did, but to me, he spoke differently. The next morning, I walked a distance of 1 mile through the plain near Naalehu, looking for a cave. There were several caves, but they did not suit me for what I wanted. Then I saw a cave that served the purpose. I examined it and said to myself, "This is the home for Ku'ula o Kalawa." I walked back home and picked up the Ku'ula and returned to the cave. As I laid the Ku'ula down, I spoke the exact words that Heneliku told me. As I left, I walked straight out and never looked back. That was the end of Ku'ula o Kalawa. I stayed that night with my great-grandfather. I asked him many questions and gave him the reasons why I wanted the answers. I told him the same thing as I told my mother, that all I wanted was to write and not to divulge the places where the relics are stored for monetary gain. I just wanted my grandchildren to read and understand all about what I knew of the Hawaiian culture. He looked at me and said, "That is very good, but I have a dangerous mission. I cannot tell you all that I know. There are some things that are taboo for me to tell you. If I see a sign and the spirit allows me, I can interpret it to you. If I am in a trance and in communication with the Ku'ula and the spirit forbids me to reveal, then you will not hear me speak. Now you know that some things are taboo. You may have some, and that is all. At any time that I open my mouth and tell what is taboo, I will know I will be punished, and that means death by what they call kanaka sick. That is the reason not to get yourself involved." He told me lots of things about a kahuna who claimed he could cure you by using different herbs for certain sicknesses. He said, then he becomes famous with the people because he cures. They think he is a great kahuna. As long as he does everything right and does not interfere with other kahunas' business, he gets along fine. If he cannot take a case, he usually sends the persons to someone who is more experienced in that line. I received my experience from my parents. They taught me all that I wanted to know. The rest I had to learn by myself. I asked him to explain what he meant by myself. He replied, I have to learn how to read their minds. This is my first protection in knowing what their moves are. Then I use my power, that is to countermand their acts, to stop them. There are lots of trade secrets I cannot divulge to you. It is my bound duty to keep them to myself until I am relieved of that responsibility. You were elected to take over, but because of your birthright, it is forbidden. And I have taken the necessary steps to free you of the responsibility. The next day, I told my great-grandfather that I was going to Kalai to see Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, the lighthouse keepers, whom I hadn't seen for some time. I understood that he was a relative of our family on mother's side. His mother and my mother were second cousins, my mother marrying a Chinese, and his mother a Haole, so I can say that he is my cousin. Mr. Johnson married a Hawaiian girl from Kauai. I bid my great-grandfather goodbye and left.